Today, General McCaffrey will speak to us on strategic national security challenges in the U.S. Please join me in welcoming General Barry McCaffrey.
Thanks, Stan. Thanks very much. Stan, thanks very much for that very generous introduction. Normally, my automatic pushback when I get a very kind, charitable intro like that is to say it's the second best introduction I ever got. And I follow it with a true story of mostly every year I go out and give a lecture on combat leadership to the Army's Command and General Staff College. You got to sort of envision the environment. 1,000 shiny young majors sitting in the sleeping hall. And the guest speaker comes out and gets introduced by a student in the group. And it's pretty intimidating. You get all your buddies out there and you have to say something nice about the old boy. The first year I gave that talk, my son was in the course and they said, "You are introducing your dad." He was overwhelmed. He sniveled. He cried. He tried to get out of it. He called me and I said, "Shut up and do what you're told." So he stumbles out on stage and he painfully reads through every word in my long bio, at the end of which he says, "However," he said, "I want you to know that I have worked for this great man for more than 21 years, primarily in the areas of lawn and automotive maintenance." Now, Stan, thanks to you and Jim McCurdy and Valerie Elliott and Vicki Oxley and the rest of the leadership for the privilege of being here. It's wonderful to have Bruce Crandall here. What a great soldier. If you have not read We Were Soldiers Once and Young, make sure you get a copy. It's in the top 5 books ever written in English about intense small unit combat. And Bruce, of course, received the Medal of Honor for his unbelievable valorous role in that action. How about a round of applause for Bruce? There's a good contingent from the University of Washington here. Randy Hodgkins, Connie Kravis, Betsy Wilson. They've just recruited me to be a hockey puck on the UW rink. And they assured me they're going to pay me the same thing Harvard does, nothing. But I was really delighted to volunteer to support their work. All 3 of my kids are University of Washington grads. 2 of the sons-in-laws are UW grads. It's a national treasure. It's one of the greatest research universities in the country. How about a round of applause to the leadership of UW? Some of my HNTB associates are here. Christine Karg at the head table, Brian Sperry, Barton Drake, and others. I'm on their board of directors. 98 years, employee-owned company that does engineering and architectural design and project management all over the country, and I'm very glad they're here with me today. A Navy table down here. Our former CNO, Tom Hayward, who I'm glad to see again. Bill Center, you all know. Herb Bridge, and others. And by the way, honest to God, this is what happened. The last words my dad, an Army Lieutenant General, said to me as I headed off for West Point was, "You're making a big mistake going to Navy." Thanks for their leadership. And Ralph Munro here, former Secretary of State. I was sad my son-in-law is not here, Jake Larson, a partner in Foster Pepper here in the community. And always gives me an opportunity to talk about, particularly the civilian audience, to remind them that 14% of our armed forces are women. And they're doing everything in this globally deployed military except direct ground combat units. My daughter served 8 years, Jake's wife, my oldest daughter. 4 years active duty, 4 years in the Washington State National Guard. While she was in the Guard, she was a major Army nurse. Her very precocious 5-year-old son knew that Mama was a soldier. He'd see her in camouflage uniform, headed off to weekend drill. He knew that every summer, active duty, 2 weeks for training, that my wife would be out here running Camp Nana for 2 weeks. True story now follows. About 4 years ago, my daughter asked him, "What would you like to be for Halloween? Would you like to be Spider-Man?" because he knew that Granddad and Spider-Man are like that. From my drug policy director days, I used them in our public relations campaign. Would you like to be a football player? Would you like to be a soldier? And he goes, soldier? Mom, I'm a boy. There's about 4 variants of that, and they're all true. He thinks dads are law partners and mothers are soldiers. At some point, we'll email you some copies of the slides that I keep updated when I'm talking about the issues of U.S. national security. And I say that because our national security challenges, which many of you in the room have been privileged to work on for years, have changed. So let me make a couple of quick points, and if I'm compressed here, maybe we'll have time for me to listen to your own ideas and respond to your own interests. A couple of points. Number one is, what is the threat? You know, for many of us, I came in the Armed Forces at age 17, 1960. We went a generation where our entire focus essentially was on the deterrence of war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. The Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, it was a global operation in which we were prepared to fight a global war, including the use of nuclear weapons, to maintain deterrence, and it worked, thank God. We never fired a shot in that war. It finally ended. You're a wired group. You've watched the change, the absolutely dramatic change in the way the world operates since the Soviet Union came apart. That does not mean, I might add, when I said one of your slides in that email you get talks about 9 continuing national security threats. One of them ought to remain a concern about fighting other nation states. North Korea, much in the news, 5 to 10 nuclear devices, a 1 million-man army run by a sociopath. He's murdered 1 million of his own people. 250,000 in concentration camps. A change of responsibility in the government that we're not sure how it will come out. And so there's no question as we look out over the coming 25 years that we'll have to take into account continuing requirement for your U.S. Armed Forces, 2.4 million men and women, Department of Defense, active guard, reserve, civilian component, who are trying to ensure through deterrence that we don't fight. So there's one threat. Clearly there are others. You know, if you have a massive national emergency, I went down 3 or 4 years ago, spent a better part of a day talking to my close personal friend Fidel Castro and Raul. Part of it was a message, me there as a professor at West Point, to underscore our concern about them acting as a launch platform for terrorist attack on the United States. And other contacts were made with the Libyans. If you go to the State Department website, you'll find there were 7 nation states on that list of people violating international law and supporting terrorist operations. There were also 44, the last time I checked it, foreign terrorist organizations who by law the Secretary of State has to tell Congress on an annual basis, here's who represents a threat to U.S. national interests and our allies. If you look at that list, it's astonishing. A good number of them, when you look at them, are fueled by criminal activity, probably 2/3. You know, if you need money, you can't get it from the Soviet Union or Cuban communists who are dirt poor, or the Chinese. So essentially, you end up seeing many of these terrorist organizations funded by small amounts of money, let's say 10 million a year, coming out of smuggling cigarettes out of North Carolina into New York City and sending it back to the Middle East. And then if you get serious about it, you've got to do extortion of the oil companies, bank robberies, kidnapping. The FARC, the ELN in Colombia are certainly unbelievable examples of that. Kidnapping being the worst of all crimes, I might add. And then you end up generating 100 million. If you want big money, you have to get involved in the drug business. So I'm in and out of Afghanistan and Iraq and other countries around the world as a West Point faculty member. If you go into Afghanistan, these are loose numbers, but probably 92% of the world's opium is produced in Afghanistan. Massive amounts, 4,000 plus metric tons. Huge amounts of money. Who knows? Let's peg it at $4 billion a year, half the country's GNP. And so you see traffic jams in downtown Kabul with Mercedes-Benz, multi-story air-conditioned, central air-heated buildings in Mazar-e-Sharif. And you say, hey, stupid, what do you think's doing this? Tourism? I mean, it's the opium business and hashish. And that acts as a blowtorch, not only on an attempt to develop a society of laws, but when you look at places like Afghanistan, they may have 1 million or more people, the UN suggesting it may be 2 million, who are addicted. Widows, orphans, police officers, a tremendous negative impact trying to develop a law-based society. Colombia, who knows? My guess is their cocaine trade generates $1 billion or more. So as you look at these terrorist organizations, which represent threats to our interests, there are massive amounts of resources behind them. It's not Chicago 1932 prohibition. It's buying international law representation, international public relations. When you corrupt somebody, it isn't a police commander. It's buying block voting behavior in national legislatures. It's a huge threat to international law enforcement. And that's where an awful lot of these terrorist organizations essentially get the grease to run their operations. Now, a third notion we ought to put on the table, and this has been one that's dropped out of the public debate in this country, in the international community, is how do you deal with weapons of mass destruction? The most, I would argue, for all of us in this room, hands down, the most serious national security threat we have to face is how to reduce the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There's at least 30 nations on the face of the earth that can go nuclear rapidly, less than 10 years. A bunch of them are halfway there. Certainly the Iranians, within a very short period of time, will develop operational nuclear devices, and they've got the delivery systems. So you're seeing the Gulf Coast states go to peaceful uses of nuclear power, which means phase one of developing a Sunni Muslim Arab bomb to counter the Persian Shia bomb. None of this bodes well for security. At some point, these weapons, when they proliferate, will be employed. The nukes, fortunately, are pretty hard to fabricate. The science of it's pretty straightforward. I mean, we did it in 1943, and we weren't sure it could be done. And so my argument would be, by the way, when the Libyans turned over their nuke development program, it was astonishing how far this third world nation had come with a minimal amount of support from the Pakistanis and the North Koreans. Basically, any second-tier university physics lab can put together a nuclear program. And if I sell you or you steal 40 kilograms of HEU, you can make one probably in 48 months fairly easily. That's a challenge. By the way, if you can make beer, you can make unstable nerve agent. If you can do perfumes, you can fabricate bioagents. We had one lone nut job, we think, at Fort Detrick, Maryland, working at night, that produced what was then alleged to be weapons-grade anthrax. And he went after the Congress, and postal workers were affected by it. It put us into a national panic. I think we had not more than 5 people killed and some 30 or 40 sickened. So that's a challenge. And by the way, the solution is multifaceted. You know, as we go to sleep tonight, you can rest assured that every one of the borders, every port, every major city, there's an intensive effort to discover fissile material being brought into the country. But that's a pretty tough place to work it. So we're out in the international community. The real solution at some point will be creating common commitment to negating the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And we need a new model. We did pretty well in deterrence with the Warsaw Pact and NATO, Soviet Union, U.S. Now it's come apart, and I would argue this is a principal threat. Then finally, we've got, besides 2 ongoing wars, and by the way, I have to remind people, your armed forces, active guard and reserve, we would have come apart without the full commitment of the reserve components. 4 or 5 years ago, we would have started unraveling. The Army and Marine Corps are so overstretched, we've got huge numbers of naval and Air Force reinforcements on ground combat roles all over Afghanistan and Iraq. It's just been astonishing. That war has cost us 46,000 killed and wounded. So if you're in a Marine battalion at the second takedown of Fallujah, there were 2 Army brigades of Marines were the primary ground combat force. We took 1,200 casualties in 4 days. It was fighting as intense as anything we ever encountered. And right now, if you're up in the mountains of the 173rd Airborne in Paktika province or around that area, these kids are in contact every day. There's a real war going on. And it's going to expand in Afghanistan. We got our hands full. Iraq and Afghanistan, you follow the issues. We can talk about them here for a few minutes. My guess would be Iraq, we're out entirely in 36 months. Most of us will be out by next Christmas. We're down to 50,000 troops. It was 35,000 plus killed and wounded. It was $800 billion. It was flawed at its inception going in. It was astonishing, the lack of good judgment. Mr. Rumsfeld, I'm a nonpartisan figure of government. I watch Mr. Rumsfeld with interest. He's charismatic, brilliant, dedicated, a patriot, wealthy, older, with unbelievable bad judgment. And we went in there with a completely inadequate force, had an insurgency well up around our ears. We lost control of it. I think probably it's going to come out okay. If you define okay as we'll end up with a viable state developing their oil. They got water, they got agriculture, their military after-a-fact works. We'll see. The 3 contending factions, I think now are sustained because the 6 nations surrounding them have decided it's not to their interest to have all-out war in Iraq and the Middle East. Afghanistan, we can talk about 100,000 U.S., 50,000 additional NATO. The Allies are going to pull out on us. They've had it. The political sustainment for the war is not there. It's $8 billion a month and a company a month killed and wounded. The armed forces can sustain that endlessly, and they'll do it. My son will deploy back into combat in June on his 4th combat tour. A lot of the special ops units, JSOC, some of them are just talked to a master sergeant and staff sergeant in the Ranger Regiment. He was on his 10th combat tour, wounded twice. So this is pretty intense commitment by your armed forces. The question is, can we sustain the will of the American people behind this effort? It's not believable to some of us that you can start withdrawing next summer. This is the work of a generation. Maybe 3, 4, 5 years of fighting. The question is, do we have the political will to do that? Do we see that as a worthwhile outcome? That's doubtful. Something worth all of us debating. Then finally, terrorism. We're trying to pull together internally in this giant nation, 307 million of us, 15 million aliens stumbling around out there in the dark right now. Some notion of how do you maintain internal security. We have no national ID card. We got 1 million people a day cross our southern border. We're not quite sure who's crossing the northern border, 5,000 miles. It's honor system, much of its length. We have completely inadequate domestic institutions to deal with counterterrorism. Marshal Service, FBI, public health system. You can't protect America if you don't have a public health system. Border Patrol. When I started, there were 4,000 Border Patrol in 96. Now there's 18,000. The right answer is 45,000. The Coast Guard, the most valuable law enforcement professional group, bar none, at interdiction at sea, 36,000. It ought to be 75,000 people with a modernized fleet and aviation arm. So we've got work to do. We've got to talk about it. We've got to understand new threats to American security. Look, Stan, these people have been paid a lot more attention to me than my family does, I might add. I tell people I'm on NBC periodically, and my 2 grown daughters, Yakima and Seattle, call me and provide substantive feedback on how I do on air. It's, Dad, good tie, good makeup, good lighting, that kind of substantive feedback. About a year ago, it's a true story, I'd been on 5-6 times during the day. Cell phone rings. My oldest daughter says, Dad, both of us girls are here in Yakima. That was a terrific interview. I said, God, that's great. I was on all day. Which one was it? Said, Dad, we don't know. We always turn the sound off. And on that note, thanks very much.
We do have time. Oops, are we on here? We do have time for a couple of questions from the floor.
19-year-old private get a hold of all these super secretive memos that he can give to Wikipedia.
It's simply outrageous. That was the important story, not the damage, which was real.
I want to repeat
the question was, how does it, by the way, I can grab these guys. How does a private get 700,000 military classified cables and 400,000 diplomatic cables? And it was a tremendous failure of collective judgment gone on for 10 years. We used to have everything behind the green door. And, it was sanitized and stuck out and used by the operational units. Now we got the whole thing networked. I go up here, I'm going to be up at Pacific Northwest National Lab tomorrow. I don't think there's a secret left in the U.S. government if you're connected to the Internet. And we got to correct that. It's simply outrageous. They're finally getting that idea. Yes, sir.
You told us that we're learning to love the Iranian bomb. The Israeli general told me on the Golan Heights that
Could we get you to wait for the mic, please?
I'll repeat the question. I can hear him. Yeah, go ahead.
an Israeli general told me on the Golan Heights that Israel would not allow Iran to have.
The question basically boils down to what will we do about Iranian nuclear effort? Will there be a military strike? The answer is no. It would be ferociously bad judgment. The U.S. could do it. If we got cooperation out of the Saudis and the Iraqis, we put 1,000 aircraft, 4 carriers at sea, in a 6-month campaign, will wreck Iran, its military, its governmental institutions, and its nuclear program. No one else could do it. The Israelis couldn't make a dent in that thing. The unclassified number is 72 known nuclear sites, many of which are underground. The only way the Israelis can do it is with nuclear weapons. So the problem that we face is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, do the Israelis see an existential threat to their national survival? If they do, they'll preempt with a nuclear strike. So we got to take diplomatic, economic, covert action to try and prevent that outcome in the coming decade. That's where we are. We can't do anything about it. They decided to go nuke. That's what's going to happen. What other thoughts you got? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I have someone at the microphone behind you who I've already selected.
Yeah. Who's going to argue with that? You also look tougher than I do, so.
Something that I don't hear discussed very much is where do all the weapons come from that all of the terrorists are using against us and in every part of the world?
Well, the quick answer is when you look at 9/11, we had a little under 3,000 Americans murdered going about their daily life. That was the biggest loss of life since the Battle of Antietam. And they took us down with our own technology. So most of these, we had a Washington area sniper. By the way, it's astonishing to me we're doing as well as we are in counterterrorism, and we are. Thank God for the FBI, Marshal Service, NSA, the agency. We're proactively gaining cooperation of international law enforcement on a global scene. The Saudis are more at risk than we are. So are the Pakistanis. So you name the state, they understand their own internal threat. Where we can't get cooperation, we're taking direct action against terrorist units. So the end of the day, though, the weapons these people are employing are not sophisticated. Look at Mexico. This is essentially almost a terrorist environment. 30,000 murdered, squads of police and army captured, tortured to death, and beheaded, and the weapons systems are small automatic weapons and hand grenades. So it doesn't take much technology to terrorize the civilian population. Well, the weapons in Mexico, just as an example, primarily AK-47s come out of the 4 U.S. border states. They're manufactured in places like Poland and China, or they're left over from the Central American wars. Again, the technology so far is pretty low level, but that guarantee doesn't exist going forward. But we're seeing a tremendous impact in international commerce off the Somali coast. These are people with dugout canoes with a motorboat on them, some AKs. We're probably down to one last question. Yes, sir.
General McCaffrey, as I understand it, the U.S. mission in Afghanistan is to degrade and disrupt the Taliban, take out al-Qaeda, until such time as the Afghan government can assume that role. Given current troop levels, the level of corruption in the Afghan government, and the use of al-Qaeda sanctuaries in Pakistan and the tribal areas, can it be done? And if so, when?
You just answered your own question. It's if you'd taken an average lieutenant colonel at the National Defense University 10 years ago and said, I have a great idea. Why don't we go 600? Axiom number 1 of the U.S. Army is never go anywhere you can't walk down to the sea and a Navy ship. We're 800 miles from the water in Afghanistan. We've got multiple warring factions. Essentially, it's a civil war between the Pashtuns and the rest of the country, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, etc. I think you can get a stable nation built. By the way, it's changed dramatically for the better. There's a road network, there's an army. When we went in there initially, it was the most depraved place on the face of the earth. Having said that, how long until we could withdraw? You can see that we could do it out in the future. The question, again, I would argue, is one of political will. That we're not in a good position. I think the least of our problems, by the way, is corruption. That bothers the New York Times immensely more than the Afghans. And I don't say that to be cruel to the New York Times, but this is sort of the background. This isn't Kansas, surely. So I don't know what's going to come out there. One of the problems is, look, we came out of Vietnam, 7 years of combat, 58,000 killed, 303,000 wounded. I had 3 combat tours. I came home, and my wife, to this day, hates U.S. politicians, reporters, and generals. And she hasn't changed her mind about any of them since then. And so the question is, will we put the blood and treasure of the United States to work for a decade and then write it off as a failed effort? We had a flawed strategy going in. We're there. The consequences of coming out are unbelievably high in suffering of the Afghan people and impact on the region. We're stuck. Now, there's one bit of good news here, by the way. Dave Petraeus, our commander over there, probably is the most talented person I ever met in my life, bar none. And we're running an incredible campaign right now in which the Taliban leadership were absolutely slaughtering them. And we're offering carrots if they'll come in and talk. And so at some point in the coming 18 months, prior to getting into the next presidential election, we'd better hope that the Taliban say, I guess we'd better stop fighting and talk. And we've seen that happen in that part of the world. So that's the only good outcome, and it might happen. Let me wrap it up there. You're busy people. You got important things to do. Just sort of underscore, watching the money you raise for the causes you support. The power of America is economic, it's military, but mostly it's the values of our people. Bar none, people like you across the country make this place worth living in. Thank God for who you are and what you stand for. Good luck.
Oh my, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us on national security, General McCaffrey. So much. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.